Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. Again, I'm Jason Scappaticci, and we'll be together for the next hour or so. I'll try to keep it to an hour. It is tough for me because there's so much to talk about with this World's Fair. I already heard people talking about this World's Fair. Yes, right, the Belgian waffles. Everyone remembers the waffles. There's lots of other things that we're going to cover with this World's Fair. And so thank you for joining. I really like being able to share these things in large part because after this is over, I don't have to grade any papers, right? So you don't have to take a test and I don't have to submit any grades. So this is just for fun and information. I'll make sure that there's time at the end. I'll stay late if I go too long so you can ask questions as well. And then after, I did bring some of my collection of souvenirs. So please, after the lecture, come on up and see some of them. I didn't bring all of them. I actually have a huge collection of souvenirs, believe it or not, that has been exhibited in museums. Yeah. So I do not have a waffle maker. I'm sorry. All right, so I have been fascinated by World's Fairs since I was a kid. And to answer a question that I get about this one, I did not attend this World's Fair. You probably could look at me and guess that, but I did not attend. My father did when he was 15 years old with his Boy Scout troop. And so my grandparents' house in Meriden had many souvenirs from this World's Fair, including the Pietà that you see right here. And so I grew up with these souvenirs from the fair. And so I've always been kind of fascinated by it. I grew up with stories of hearing about this World's Fair. This World's Fair is so memorable for people in this part of the country especially. So many people went to this World's Fair if you grew up in Connecticut. And so this was one of my first topics that I decided to make a lecture about many years ago. And I was surprised at what I learned. It was a controversial World's Fair. It wasn't even an official World's Fair by the Bureau of International Expositions. And people at the time were critical of it. Now, we remember all of these great things about this World's Fair, but this World's Fair almost didn't open for the second season because it was such a financial failure. So yeah, really interesting things that kind of are lost to history, and we remember just this beautiful World's Fair that was this incredible event. So we're gonna talk about the history, why this World's Fair was created, and then we're gonna talk about the construction of the fair, and then we're gonna go into a little bit of the exhibits of the fair. I'll take you through some of the most popular exhibits. Obviously, this being a huge fair, it was at that point one of the largest World's Fairs ever put on in terms of land area. It was about 1 square mile. So at that point, this was one of the largest World's Fairs ever created. So we're actually going to start, though, somewhere else. We're going to start here. This is New York's first World's Fair. New York's first World's Fair was held from 1853 to 1854. It was the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, and it was inspired by what's considered the first World's Fair, 1851 in London. In London, you may be aware that they built this huge thing called the Crystal Palace, which was just a large greenhouse, essentially. But at the time, I know to our modern eyes, this does not look like modern architecture, but this would have been modern, having been made of iron and glass. And so this was built, again, really copying London's. This is on a much smaller scale than London's. But if you are familiar with Manhattan, if you know where the New York Public Library is, right behind it is a park. That's where this was. The library was not there. The library was the Croton Reservoir at the time. So the Croton Reservoir was right next door to this. So this Crystal Palace was the first site of the World's Fair in New York. This one's really famous for us, and those of us in Connecticut know this perhaps because of Otis. This is where he hoisted himself up in an elevator and then cut the line, and then the safety brake caught and he didn't die. And so people were like, wow, elevators, they're safe now. And that's where Otis took off, was this World's Fair. He exhibited that technology. So this building, unfortunately, did not stand for very long. It burnt down in 1858. And London's, though, did stand for much longer. And if you are interested, London's Crystal Palace was moved to another park in London. And London's Crystal Palace burnt down in the 1930s. And they managed to get newsreel footage there and recorded it burning. You can see it on YouTube if you are interested to see London's Crystal Palace fire. Next door to this was entertainment, which is a feature of every World's Fair. This is the Latin Observatory. So you can see the side there of the Crystal Palace, and then this is the Latin Observatory, which was at the time the tallest structure in New York City when it was built. And for an additional fee, you could take a steam elevator to the top, and you could take in the panoramic views of New York Harbor and Manhattan. This, unfortunately, did not stand for very long either. It also burnt down in 1856. So remnants of this first World's Fair in New York, there are pieces certainly left, but no buildings or anything of that nature remain. Now, the next World's Fair takes place in New York, in an unusual place, and it takes place here. This is called the Valley of Ashes. It's the Corona dump, and it's actually called the Valley of Ashes by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he talks about it in The Great Gatsby. And so in The Great Gatsby, if you've ever read it, they take their cars through this area, and I won't read the whole excerpt, but he says it's a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. So this is literally owned by the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company, and it is where New York dumped their ashes for decades. And it is a huge expanse of ashes and marshland. And it's an eyesore in the city in the middle of Queens. And so the mayor of New York, a guy named LaGuardia, doesn't want this sitting in the middle of Queens and does arrange for the purchase of it in the 1930s. They bought it in 1934 for $2.7 million. But it being the Depression, they didn't have a lot of money to do much with it at that point. So they did put a couple of parkways through it, organized by this guy, Robert Moses. So you can see Grand Central Parkway gets built through it. This is a picture of it from the 40s. If you've been on the Grand Central Parkway recently, it doesn't look like that. You can see in this picture it was actually a parkway. There's actual trees and parkland next to it, including a bike path, no less. Much of this is gone now, of course, as these highways have been expanded and expanded because it's New York City. But this is what they originally started to put through this parkland until eventually a World's Fair asked to use the land and hosted the second New York World's Fair, the 1939-1940 World's Fair. And so this World's Fair was, again, culturally a booming success. You can see the centerpiece of the World's Fair here. That's the Trilon and the Perisphere. Unfortunately, bad timing for this World's Fair, right? World War II starts September 1939. America gets into it 2 years thereafter. And so this World's Fair, while popular, attended by millions and millions of visitors, was also not a financial success. And unfortunately, the Trilon and Perisphere, which maybe would have been preserved, were melted down for the war effort after the World's Fair closed. They were much needed metal for the war. But this World's Fair was a cultural success. Here you can see some images of this World's Fair. You can see that's Electro, that's the Westinghouse robot that they predicted every household would have by the late 20th century. I don't know about you, but I do not have an electronic butler yet, so didn't happen for my family. And then you can see here the image in the upper right and the bottom left. That's Futurama, which was the runaway success of this World's Fair. That was the GM exhibit, and Futurama was really very well done. You sat in these chairs, as you can see here, and it took you over America of the future. This World's Fair was really the first World's Fair that largely focused on the future, as opposed to current technology and predictive about what they thought it would look like. And so in Futurama, GM showed you their version of the future, where you start in the American countryside and you follow what's called a highway into suburbs and then, of course, into the cities. And in these cities, there's multiple levels. There's street level, and then there's pedestrian level and train level down here. It's their prediction of what they think the future will look like. And GM, like I said, did a brilliant job. This was the most popular exhibit of the fair. When you got out of the exhibit, you were given a pin that said, "I have seen the future at General Motors." And you actually got out, you exited into a mock-up of an intersection from that city that you had just seen. And so people were, quite dazzled. In fact, if you look closely at the bottom left, that is actually a line of people waiting to get in that you see snaking out there. So this was a real popular exhibit. Now, so these are the two World's Fairs that happened in New York prior to the one we're talking about tonight. And so, believe it or not, the inspiration for the '64 World's Fair happens because a group of men who grew up in New York City were talking about attending this World's Fair in the late 50s. They were out to dinner together. They were successful businessmen, and they were lamenting that this was such an educational event for them, they wish their children could have something similar. And that's actually how the original kernel of the 1964 World's Fair was planted. One of the men at this dinner was a guy named Robert Koppel. He was a very prominent businessman in New York and a very prominent property owner. And so he really took the ball and ran with it and started to organize. So he was the first real president of the 1964 World's Fair Committee. And so he began lobbying the city of New York to get their endorsement. Eventually, the Wagner administration endorsed. They lobbied New York State and eventually lobbied the federal government, and the Eisenhower administration endorsed the idea of New York hosting a World's Fair in the 1960s. And so they eventually decide that he's not going to run it. He never wanted to run it. And so they need a new president to run it. Running a World's Fair is complicated. They are still hosted today, by the way. Many people in America are unaware of that. There will be one next year, rather 2025 if you're interested. So running a World's Fair is the most that I can liken it to is hosting the Olympics. So you know how there's a lot of construction for the Olympics and all of that stress to get that up and running. It's very similar to a World's Fair. And so while the World's Fair Committee is making plans in the late 50s, they really need somebody who's going to oversee this and run this, and they can't find anybody. Nobody wants the job. They offered it to Billy Rose. Billy Rose was a famous Broadway producer, and he said, "I'd rather be hit in the head with a baseball bat," to the press when the press asked him about this. And so they ultimately decided on a controversial figure, Robert Moses. So Robert Moses, I could do a whole lecture just on Moses. I'm not going to get in too deeply into Robert Moses. He's controversial then. He's still controversial today. Robert Moses was at the end of his career. Robert Moses had an enormous amount of power and was never elected to public office, and yet had incredible amounts of power. By this point in his career, he was the Commissioner of Parks for New York City and the Commissioner of Parks for New York State. He was the head of the New York State Power Authority, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, and the Slum Clearance Committee, one of the things that made him very popular because he was a big fan of urban redevelopment in the 50s and 60s. And in fact, it was joked that Robert Moses would rather knock down a building than walk around it. And Robert Moses loved cars, interestingly, and never even had a driver's license. So he was driven everywhere. And I have to say, I would love cars too if I was driven everywhere, right? Traffic wouldn't matter to me. But at any rate, he's certainly an interesting guy, and he's going to be in charge of this World's Fair. He's 70 years old at the time, and he very gladly takes the job in 1960 to be the president of the World's Fair Committee. The job paid $100,000 a year. The mayor of New York made $40,000 a year at that time. So this is an important job and a well-paid job. They have arranged to rent the same park where the 39 and 40 World's Fair were hosted, Corona Park, for $1 a year. And so they will host the World's Fair there. Moses jumped into this work, and he had one of his criteria to join the World's Fair Committee was, he said, "I'll become president, but Robert Koppel, the guy who's got us here, cannot be on the committee because he hates him." They had a falling out in the 50s when Robert Koppel fought Robert Moses on one of the highways he wanted to build. So Moses held a grudge. And so Robert Koppel resigned from the committee, was given $35,000 for the work that he had done up to that point, and was given free passes for the fair for him, his wife, and his children. So he didn't turn out too bad. He attended the fair and had a great time. Meanwhile, Moses begins hiring a full staff to make all of the arrangements that need to be made for this World's Fair. The World's Fair staff eventually gets up to almost over 200, and they anticipate 70 million visitors for this World's Fair. Now he has to finish what Robert Koppel started, and they have to get endorsed by the Bureau of International Expositions. So just like there's an International Olympic Committee, there is one that runs fairs. And they have not yet endorsed New York's. So Moses travels to Paris, where they are based, to get their endorsement, which they reject, because America is breaking a couple of rules. A country can only host one major exposition in a 10-year period. And America already had one in Seattle in 1962. So the Century 21 exposition had already been planned. It was already going to happen. So they said, we cannot endorse because of that. They also said, you're breaking other rules. World's Fairs can only be open for one season, one 6-month season, not 2 6-month seasons. And so Robert Moses refused to budge on this. As a result, the Bureau of International Expositions would not endorse this World's Fair, so it is not endorsed by the BIE. It's not an official World's Fair. So it's quite interesting, right? Because many people today hardly even know that. My father never knew that. But what this meant for this World's Fair was that the member nations of the BIE could not participate. And the member nations were mainly Western Europe. So that meant that their governments could not give money that would fund construction of pavilions at this World's Fair. Now, there were pavilions, certainly from France and Spain and things like that. They were put on by private enterprise from those countries. They were not endorsed by the governments of those countries. Now, this unfortunately caused a bit of a snafu for Moses. He had a number of press snafus he often does throughout his career. This incident in Paris caused a bit of international incident because when he was asked by the press in Paris about the experience with the BIE, he said, "We don't take this BIE business very seriously. They're just 3 people living obscurely in a dumpy Paris apartment." So certainly not making any friends in Paris, unfortunately. Meanwhile, Seattle launches and is a huge success. So Seattle got 2 million more visitors than they thought they would get. There were a small World's Fair. They figured they would get 4 million. They got 6 million visitors, and it was a booming success. It was also good for New York because up until the start of the Seattle World's Fair, sales had been a little slow getting exhibitors at New York. After this, people really began clamoring to be a part of the New York World's Fair. So this World's Fair was a booming success. The New York World's Fair Committee thought this certainly bodes well for us. We may get as many as 100 million people coming to visit our fair over the 2 seasons. They thought maybe as many as 50 million each season. In the end, that turned out not to be true. They had 50 million total over the 2 seasons. So this is a map of the future park that Moses planned to build with the proceeds from the World's Fair. World's Fairs, for much of their history, were designed to make money. They were designed to turn a profit, and then that committee would then take this money and do things for that city that hosted. And so that was the goal here. They were going to take the proceeds from the World's Fair, and they were going to build Queens, essentially its version of Central Park. And he called it basically Central Park for Queens, which it is sort of today. If you've ever visited, it is a lovely park, and it is now full of fields and things like that Moses had envisioned back then. This was his ultimate goal. He always kept this map on his wall to plan this $23 million park as a gift to the city after the fair was over. So meanwhile, planning continues. Fair officials announced that they would sell advanced tickets. And so you could buy advanced tickets starting on April 22nd, 1963, which was 1 year before the fair would open. So you can see here during the fair, adult admissions is $2. Child admissions to the fair is $1. Eventually, these prices were increased for the second season. As I told you, they had financial difficulties. So These prices were upped, unfortunately. But the advance ticket sales was hugely popular. They sold 1 million by September. They sold 2 million by November. And the advance tickets became a popular stocking stuffer that year for people to buy as gifts for their family and friends. And they became popular corporate Christmas bonuses that year. So for example, IBM and United Airlines each bought 100,000 tickets to distribute to their employees as Christmas gifts. And AT&T bought 250,000 tickets to distribute to their employees that year, their employees who lived in the tri-state area, as Christmas gifts. So meanwhile, while the fair is being planned, they are also doing what Robert Moses loves. They're expanding highways. So there were multiple highway expansion projects, 5 in Queens alone, to get people to the fair. This park does have a subway stop, and also did have a stop on the Long Island Railroad. So there were other means to get there, but cars, of course, are Moses's love, and so those are what he thinks primarily people are going to go to the fair in. Now, because of these construction projects happening on these expressways simultaneously, it did cause major traffic snafus for much of the years leading up to the fair. During this period of time, the Long Island Expressway was dubbed the world's longest parking lot. And I don't know if you've been on it recently, but it's still very similar to that. And they had to decide on a centerpiece. So fairs often have a notable centerpiece. So we saw the Trilon and Perisphere. The Space Needle is made for Seattle, 62. And the Eiffel Tower is made for Paris, 1889, their exhibition. And so World's fairs often have some sort of central piece of architecture. And so they had a competition to try to figure out what would this World's Fair central piece be. And ultimately, it turned out to be a gift from US Steel, and it was called the Unisphere. So here we can see the Unisphere being constructed. They thought this really brought the theme of peace through understanding, which was the theme of this World's Fair. It is 140 feet tall, 120 feet wide. It's the largest globular structure ever constructed in the world. It is made of 940,000 pounds of stainless steel. And it was a gift, as I said, of US Steel. If you go to see it today, you can't miss that it was a gift of US Steel, because it's all over. You know that they donated this to the American people. Some people didn't like it. They derided it as the world's largest bird cage. I think that's a little unfair. I think it's very cool. As you can see, it was put in a huge fountain that had a double rings of fountains around it during the fair. And also, it has these rings that go around it that were supposed to be reminiscent of man orbiting the Earth, which, of course, we had recently achieved. And so this became the central piece of the fair. It was on most of the advertisements for the fair. You can't miss it. And in the background, by the way, way at the upper left, you can see a newly completed Shea Stadium, which is now gone, of course. So here is a picture of the fair, less than a year before it opens, and it is under construction. The construction of the fair took years to finish. Ultimately, 66 nations, 24 states, and 300 companies had buildings at the fair, all of which had to be built by the time the fair opened in April of 1964. The World's Fair committee thought that it would be an interesting publicity idea to have this countdown digital clock to the start of the fair. And so, because it was, new technology, and so they had this big press event where they started the clock. And so outside of their offices at the World's Fair site was this countdown clock to when the opening day of the fair would be. The World's Fair staff referred to that clock as the ulcer maker, because it was a constant reminder of all the work that needed to be done. And then, in a weird twist, somebody programmed it wrong, and it actually ended 3 days before the start of the fair. So the time had been wrong the entire time, unfortunately. But they had a number of interesting publicity things. So here what we're looking at is construction of This is the Lagoon of Industry, that sort of circular area up there, and the most prominent industrial exhibitors are going to be around here. So IBM and General Electric, the biggest exhibitors will be here. And you can see one of the parkways elevated at the top of the photo. Unfortunately, that one in particular, they had finished their expansion of it, and then when they were building these pavilions, the vibrations from the construction caused the highway to crack, and they had to redo the highway again before the fair. So here is a master plan of what the fair will look like. And so we have it divided into a couple of areas. Here is the transportation area. And so this is where you'll have your car companies, airlines, things of that nature. And then you can see the Unisphere right there in the center. And around that is governments. So states and then foreign governments. That big square donut is the government of the United States. So that is our building. And then you can see the Lagoon of Industry. You can see all the industrial exhibits. And then over here we have Lake Amusement. World's Fairs always have like an amusement park. And we're going to talk about Lake Amusement at the World's Fair. But this is what the World's Fair map looked like in all the guidebooks from 1964 and 1965. So opening day of the fair is April 22nd, 1964. And you could have been invited to a 10,000 person event at the Singer Bowl at the fair, which of course is Singer sewing machines. And so at this event, you would have heard President Johnson give a speech and Indira Gandhi give a speech about world peace and peace through understanding, the themes of the fair, of course. And the fair was off to a slow start. They were surprised. Only 92,000 people attended the first day. Only 92,000, and they expected 200,000. And so like I said, this fair was not nearly as popular as planners thought it would be, and unfortunately did not turn a profit. So the fair only returned about 19 cents on every dollar invested into it. So if you had bought a bond, which is how many of these fairs fund their construction, you would only have gotten 19 cents on every dollar you invested. Regardless, though, you all, undoubtedly, if you attended, you remember great things about this fair, right? You don't remember the financial issues or any issues with construction. Now, I should say that by opening day, Robert Moses's leadership had this fair 85% complete, which is excellent for an opening fair. Some fairs open at 60% complete. And Robert Moses really, as challenging as he could be, he was an efficient administrator in that the job did get done. So let's explore some of the pavilions of the fair. I want to start first with this one. This is Texas, and the Texas Fair Pavilion is a Texas-sized failure and is one of the more unusual stories of the fair. So the Texas Pavilion is in the Lake Amusement area. It's actually not with the rest of the states. They're in the Lake Amusement area. And for some reason, Texas built an auditorium as part of their exhibit, and they intended on using proceeds from a special show that they were going to show in the auditorium to run their pavilion. And I'm not sure, I still can't find out why Texas chose this show, but they chose a review of Broadway standards called To Broadway with Love, because when I think of Texas, I think of Jerome Kern and Broadway, right? No, I don't know why they chose it. I still can't find out why. But the show, unfortunately, cost extra, and people didn't go. In desperation, they let people in for free and passed the basket. That still didn't work. And the Texas Pavilion eventually had to close. The state did step in with funding, and so it did not ultimately have to, but it was going to have to close. And one of the interesting things about Texas Pavilion is that it was run by Angus Wynn, who you probably know because he owns Six Flags. So you think this guy could figure out how to make something amusing, right? His nephew was in charge of the pavilion, and his nephew returned to the fair a late night after drinking and had to get something from his office, and he was on fairgrounds when he shouldn't be. And he was found by the World's Fair police, and he was arrested. He was belligerent. They brought him to the local Queens police station, and they locked him up. He called his friends that he was living with in Queens with his one call, and they showed up and attempted to break him out, and then ended up in the clink with him. So yeah, Texas was an interesting, lots of interesting stories about the Texas Pavilion. And the Texas Pavilion, as I said, is in the lake amusement area. You can see some of the monorail. There was a little monorail that went around the lake amusement area. Here's another image of it. So you can see the monorail on the left of the photo now. The monorail was brought, by the way, to Texas. Texas bought it. And they were going to use it as a people mover at Houston International Airport. They never installed it. And so it still sits to this day rusting in a field in Texas. So the lake amusement area, this whole section that I showed you on the map, is really the carnival type part of the fair. World's fairs up till this one always had this sort of carnival-like atmosphere, a section of the fair that was more like rides and games and things of that nature, not necessarily educational, right? But the lake amusement area was not popular at all. It was soon dubbed the ghost town. And it's unusual because these areas always stay open later than the rest of the fair. So the fair closes at 10. This stays open till 2 a.m. and they have fireworks every night at midnight. And yet, people weren't showing up. They tried multiple things. They tried additional signage to get people there. They thought maybe it was too dark at night. They added $100,000 worth of floodlighting to try to get people there. They gave 42,000 discounted tickets to cab drivers in the hopes that they would go and then they would talk about it with the people in their cabs, their fares. None of these things worked. And ultimately, the problem was, it just wasn't very amusing because Robert Moses refused one attraction that had been a part of every World's Fair up to this point in time. And I don't want to scandalize any of you, but it was burlesque shows and peep shows and strip shows. Those had been a feature of World's Fairs up until this. Chicago World's Fair of 1893, Little Egypt. And Little Egypt, that's probably the first time Americans saw a belly dance. In 1904, St. Louis, it was Mysterious Asia was the name of one of the popular pavilions. At the 1939 World's Fair in New York, none other than Gypsy Rose Lee performed her burlesque show at the fair. And Robert Moses said, absolutely not. Not in my fair. He was scandalized by things like this. One of his critics said, Moses thinks he's God, but fortunately, he's only Moses. Moses, like I said, I could do a whole lecture just on that guy. One of my favorite stories of the fair was Moses was taken to the French Pavilion, which I mentioned that the French businesses got together and they did actually make a French Pavilion. So you would expect, of course, the French Pavilion has the can-can. And that would be a show at the French Pavilion. Robert Moses was shocked by all of the ankle and ruffles that were shown at the can-can at the French Pavilion. And what I think is more interesting, the show of the can-can at the French Pavilion was not performed by live women, it was puppets. And so Robert Moses was shocked by puppet leg. I don't know why, but interesting nonetheless. So this whole area was just not popular because it didn't have the things that they always had. Honky-tonks and things like that were not allowed here. And as a result, it didn't thrive. So this building was one of the few that was built to be permanent. Most World's Fairs buildings are built to be temporary. And so this one was built to be permanent. This is the Port Authority building. And so this Port Authority building featured one of the most expensive restaurants at the fair. That's the top of the fair restaurant that you can see there. And you can also see a helicopter landing. It did have a helipad on the roof. And so if you were very well-to-do, this is how you may have arrived to the fair. You could take a train to Grand Central, and then you would go next door to the Pan Am building, take it to the roof, and take a helicopter over to this building. And that's how you would enter the fair. That's how Jacqueline Kennedy entered the fair when she brought Caroline. in 1964. So this building also featured a history of the Port of New York, which of course is one of America's most important ports. And this building featured for the first time for Americans to see a new development by the Port Authority called the World Trade Center. And so they had a scale model of what that might look like when it will be completed in the 70s. The Illinois Pavilion is one of the runaway successes of this fair. So Illinois decided that they would pay tribute to their most famous person from Illinois, President Lincoln. And they hired a company called Walt Disney to help them design their show. So Walt Disney and his Imagineers decided that they would make an animatronic Abe Lincoln. They used his death mask to cast his face, and he would recite excerpts from his most famous speeches to an audience. And my father vividly remembers waiting in line for something like an hour and a half to go see this. This was a huge success of the fair. And this, if you've been to the Hall of Presidents, this is the inspiration. It started at this fair, and then Disney eventually expanded on the idea to create the Hall of Presidents. Another huge success of the fair was the Pepsi-Cola Pavilion. Pepsi-Cola asked Disney as well to create a ride for them that expanded on the idea of peace through understanding. And so they created a ride with 350 animatronic children that blinked their way right into your heart and sang you a song about world peace called It's a Small World. Yeah, sorry, you're gonna have that stuck in your head now. But that was a huge success of the fair. So in this bottom photograph, actually what you're looking at on the other side here, this is the line to get in. And it was an additional cost. So It's a Small World cost extra. And in fact, Pepsi donated all the proceeds to UNICEF. And so this was a huge success of the fair. Sometimes wait times were as long as 2 hours to get in to see It's a Small World. This is the GE Pavilion. The GE Pavilion was one of the prominent ones right on the Lagoon of Industry. So they had a show on nuclear fission. You can see that that's depicted on the right. They also had a ride, and their ride was also made by Walt Disney and Company. You're seeing a theme, I'm sure. So he and his Imagineers designed a ride for GE called the Carousel of Progress. And so for those of you who have not been in it, it is a rotating auditorium, and you move from vignette to vignette of an American family. You start in the 1890s, and then you go to the 1910s, the 1940s, and then finally you end in 1964, the modern day. And all along the way, this family's life is made better by GE products. And there's also a catchy song called There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. And you can still ride this ride in Walt Disney World if you would like to. It was moved because it was so successful and made a permanent ride at the fair, at the Walt Disney World, rather. This is the Ford Pavilion in the transportation area. Ford Pavilion was also designed, the ride was also designed by Walt Disney and Company, and it was called the Magic Skyway Ride. The Magic Skyway Ride in the Ford Pavilion brought you through vignettes of the history of the world, the development of the world. So here you can see on the right, this family is looking at what it would have been like in the time of dinosaurs, right? And you would go through, and you don't ride in like a regular car, you ride in Ford cars, actual Fords. In 1964, you rode in the most recent models, and then they brought in new models for the next year. My father, who attended this, very much remembers going to this pavilion, and he waited when he got to the front of the line because he did not want to ride in a Ford Fairlane. He wanted a Mustang. And so he waited till the next Mustang became available. But this was, again, one of the very popular exhibits of the fair. You can see, if you closely here, these are the cars in this part of the ride that's going into the exhibit. So really, really interesting. One of my favorite stories of the people who worked at the fair actually comes from this pavilion. So I've met a number of people who worked at the fair. Over time, they've come to my lectures, or I've met them online. And I think it's important to remember, the fair was largely staffed by late teens and people in their college age, right? This is what they did. These were summer jobs. And they talk about how boring it was to run these rides. And at the Ford Pavilion, one of the people said that they used to spice things up, the guys would find an attractive girl in the line and tell her that she was the 1 millionth customer, and then give her like a special tour and take a picture with her and stuff like that. And it was all totally a sham. It was totally fake. It was just for them to have some fun while they were working. But he said that sometimes they would have 2 or 3 1 millionth customers a day at the Ford Pavilion. So the New York State Pavilion is also one that's designed to be permanent. It's still there today, and it's designed by one of America's leading architects of the time, a guy named Philip Johnson. You can see his house, a glass house, where he lived in Connecticut, if you would like to. So he certainly has designed some of the most well-known buildings in the United States, and he designed this for New York State. It was built at an enormous cost, $11.5 million. It featured the largest suspension roof in the world. That's this, what you're looking at here. This was a suspension roof over the largest portion of the exhibit, which you can see up there. Under that suspension roof was the largest map in the world. You can see a close-up of it here. It was a terrazzo map of New York State, and it was paid for by Texaco. So it showed you where every Texaco in New York State was, just in case you needed to know that while you were in the pavilion. It also had a theater, Theaterama, which you can see over there on the side. Theaterama was decorated, you can see some of the artwork. So it was actually painted by artists of the time, pop artists of the time, and they commissioned them to do exhibits around Theaterama. Warhol did one of the exhibits around Theaterama. You may know Warhol's style, so he decided that what his contribution would be to paint the FBI's top 10 most wanted, which Robert Moses ordered painted over before the start of the fair. Now, the story goes that it was actually Governor Rockefeller who ordered it painted over because he knew one of the guys. I'm sure that's not true, though. And then there were also these tall towers that you can see here. And so the tallest one was the tallest structure at the fair. It was 226 feet high. And you could, for 50 cents, you could take a Sky Streak elevator up to the top, and you could take in views, of course, of the fair, but also of New York Harbor and into Manhattan and into Connecticut and out into the Atlantic. This is another one where an elevator operator told me that they used to get really bored running the elevators. And they said that one of the things they used to do is they would tell their customers on the ride up that due to pressurized changes, they needed to exit the elevator backwards. And they would actually get people to do it. And then the people would exit backwards and then be laughed at by the people who, of course, had been duped on their way up. And here we have the second most popular pavilion at the fair. Number 1 was GM. Number 2 is the Vatican. Vatican featured many things of interest, but perhaps the most famous thing, besides the papal tiara, was the Pietà. And so if you're unfamiliar with this, the Pietà is a statue by Michelangelo that depicts the grieving Blessed Virgin holding Jesus, who has been taken down from the cross. It has left the Vatican once, here. That's it. Never left before, it has never left since. I bet it won't leave again. And so for this, they specially quarried a 13,000-ton block of marble, which is what it's sitting on. They dramatically lit it from the back, as you can see, with this blue velvet, dramatically lit from above. And it was, by all accounts, an incredibly moving exhibit to see. You didn't actually walk into it. You stood on a moving platform. There were 3 tiers of moving platforms to get people through. They could get as many as 75,000 people through the exhibit a day. because the platform was continually moving. And so that's how you viewed it. Interestingly, even back then, Vatican folks were concerned about the Pietà. Of course, it's priceless. But one of the things they were concerned about then, believe it or not, was America's love of guns. And so they exhibited it behind bulletproof glass because they were worried that anti-Catholics Americans would try to take a shot at it. Of course, they recognized that John Kennedy had been the first Catholic president, but had not been without trouble, as you know. People were upset about that. And so they were concerned about what the reaction would be. And of course, they were concerned with the transport in general because not too long before, one of their ships had sunk. And so they transported it on the Christopher Colombo, which you can see here. And they built a special Pietà crate. So you can see that. It's being lifted by a crane. That's right outside St. Peter's Basilica. You can actually see the front of St. Peter's right there. So the Pietà crate did not get transported in the hold. It was transported on deck because the thought was, should the ship sink, the crate may be able to be saved. The crate had water-activated flotation devices that would pop out should the Pietà crate hit the water, and it had a water-activated radio beacon. So should the Christopher Columbus sink, like the Andromeda did, in theory, the Pietà would float and ping, and they could still find it. And we're going to end our tour here. This is the Travelers Pavilion. Of course, we are from the Hartford area, so we have to look at the Travelers Pavilion. And so this is it here. Now, some people think it looks like a giant red clam, and I can see that. It is, in fact, the Traveler's Red Umbrella. I'm sure you could tell that. And so this had an exhibit on the triumph of man, and so it was the development of humankind. So there are exhibits of, the wheel invented, things of that nature, important developments in human history. And I remember very much a souvenir from this, which was a little 45 record that was bright red, that was the tour, and it had a booklet of the different things that you would go through. So I very much remember playing with that as a child. And I met one of the directors of this pavilion as well. He was a young junior executive and had been sent to New York to run this pavilion with his wife. The company put them up in an apartment in Queens. To them, this was like heaven. And he tells us a story during the second season of one of his employees coming up to him towards the end of a night and saying, it's raining in the pavilion. And so sure enough, they went, and literally, he said, over the exhibit where man discovers fire, it was pouring through the ceiling onto the cavemen discovering fire. And he said to me, the Traveler's Umbrella can't leak. And what had actually happened was the red was a new form of plastic. It was a plastic coating. And it had expanded and contracted so much over the seasons that it ripped. And so they had to do emergency patching of the Traveler's Umbrella so that it would hold through the remainder of the fair. So there are still pieces of it today. Like I told you, New York State's pavilion is looking pretty sad. It has not been open for quite some time. Now, there are people that are attempting to restore this pavilion. In fact, what they want to do is turn it into an outdoor theater. So kind of like how Central Park does, Shakespeare in the Park in that theater. If you've never been, do it, it's cool. They want to do the same thing here in Queens. So they want to restore this area that you can see and turn it into a large outdoor theater. Prior to the pandemic, they actually opened it up a couple days every summer. And for $10, you could go in, kind of walk around, and they use the proceeds to begin restoration. And so my understanding is they have started to do that again. So if you're interested and you're ever down in the city, you might be able to take a peek into the New York State Pavilion. The Port Authority building is still there. Very popular venue for weddings. I've been to this site probably 3 times. It seems like there's always a wedding there, in part because the Botanical Gardens of Queens are right next door. And so beautiful places for pictures. In fact, I know a couple of people who have attended weddings at at what used to be the Pavilion and is now a banquet event. And then, of course, the Unisphere. Unisphere is very much still there and is very much a loved part of the city. And I have yet to see it when the fountains are working, despite the fact that I've been there multiple times. But Hopefully one of these days when I get there, I will see it with the fountain working. So like I said, I could go on and on and on, but I know that I've already been talking an hour, and I also want to make sure that you all can ask questions. But I hope you enjoyed the pieces of the fair that I shared with you tonight. So.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.